Mother of the Wolves by Daniela Parker. Read by Angela Bond and Emily Koczynski. Part 1. Unlikely Heroes. Under her breath. 2 doors linger at the precipice of a great destiny. One leads to a steep fall, one leads to flight. I stood at the doorway and for an uncertain moment thought I might turn away. One may not know the hour of their death, but they can choose when to start living. Maybe we don't know how to die, but only how to survive. I knew surviving and living are something altogether different, and I wondered which I was choosing as I gripped the long handle with both hands and leaned myself back to pry the heavy glass entrance ajar. Ice-cold air stung my cheeks as it expelled from the building and dissipated into the summer heat behind me. I caught my foot in the space between the door and the doorframe and pulled my body into the lobby, letting it slam back into place with a heavy thud. The lobby secretary was a delicate-boned teenager, sitting cross-legged in a knee-high pleated skirt and short-sleeved white v-neck. She blew a purple bubble that grew as big as an orange before popping against her bored face, then licked it up placidly with one hand propped beneath her chin and began chewing again. The soft hand holding up her lazy head was covered in brass bracelets from wrist to elbow. With her right hand, she lackadaisically pressed the buttons on the keyboard of her white laptop, and instantly a long sheet of paper began printing. The crowd of people seated in the waiting room inched forward nervously. Most were reading magazines on e-readers or doodling on electronic crossword puzzles, but it was only because this felt more familiar than sitting empty-handed, while the reality of the situation pressed adamantly upon their minds. And it didn't matter much as they listened to the horrifying shrieking of ink lasers moving back and forth on crisp paper. Even as they played the latest video games muted in their hands, their eyes stole anxious glances up at her and at each other. Who would it be this time? Was it someone's mother, father? Would someone lose their son? I took a deep breath, whisked my long brown hair away from my shoulders, and began the slow, dreadful walk up to the glossy white desk surrounding her like a round spaceship. The paper that had printed detached automatically and fell onto the desk. She caught me straining to see the words, and before I could read anything, turned it upside down with a snap into the wire letter tray. Then looked at me squarely and half annoyed.
"May I help you?"
She forced a smile. "Yes," I cleared my throat. "I'm here for my annual checkup."
"Fill this out and have a seat."
She handed me a tablet. Head shot up from the waiting room towards me. I could feel their spying eyes burning into my back, but when I swept myself around to look at them, they turned back to their fake reading. There were only a few seats left, one beside a lady crocheting a long green scarf that dribbled down her fat leg. Her arms covered both armrests, and her body obstructed both seats beside her. And then there was one vacant seat beside a man dressed in stained blue jeans and a blue-collared work shirt with the name Bill printed on a patch above his left breast pocket. I could smell the stench of his sweaty body wafting from him through the other half of the lobby, and decided to squeeze into the seat next to the lady. But it wasn't just because of his odor, but mainly because I didn't care for men or their proximity. "Sorry," I said as she shifted her weight away from me and continued crocheting, needles swirling in effortless circles. She smiled, round dimpled cheeks blushing. "We're all here for the same reason, dear. Good luck to you." I had known nothing else in my lifetime. They had already trained the dogs when I was born, but my parents said they had lived in a world without fear of GCMS, which stands for gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis. People used to go to the doctor and come home with a diagnosis, and then they would return to get medication. And if they had cancer, they would get things like chemotherapy. About 50 years back, there was a huge medical breakthrough. Scientists learned how to detect cancer by using a breathalyzer that measured aldehydes, hydrocarbons, alcohols, ketones, esters, nitriles, aromatic compounds, and things like that. It was going to save lives by giving early detection, or so they thought. An old black man sitting to my right leaned his gangly body against me.
"You're young,"
He whispered. His breath was hot on my ear.
If the dogs come, run. If they come for me, I'm done for. But you have young legs.
His voice was deep and raspy. I knew he was serious, even as he chuckled a bit and gave up a mucusy cough. But they were only rumors of those who had escaped. My hands began trembling. I took left hand and right and held them tightly against my lap. The cold of the room made my shaking worse, and so my teeth chattered a little as I bent my head towards him to respond. His skin was like old black leather, dry and white in the creases of the wrinkles. A man that old was a rare sight, and I hadn't seen one personally in months. His black face was spotted with dark freckles and blotches where the sun had burned into him over the years, and loose skin created deep folds of puffy circles under his eyes. "How did you survive for so long?" I whispered.
God blessed me with a healthy body and a lively spirit. But it won't be long before I go to my Creator. You gotta run, though. Understand? Run.
My parents told me the classes had been separating for a long time. The rich had slowly gained too much control. Poor people were always too busy finding sustenance to care what anyone did or what the politics of the country were. And the middle class? The middle class had been caught up in the American dream, which only turned out to be an illusion invented to distract them, while the 1% did the real trick of taking over the country. As the middle class struggled to obtain the most attractive body and to wear the most fashionable clothes or buy the biggest house and the newest car, they took up loans and everything without realizing they never really owned anything. Most had more than $600,000 debt, including college loans and property. I guess no matter what you have, you at some point get unhappy, and the elite became greedier with each passing year. Government politicians pushed for huge taxes to be placed on the middle class that excluded the wealthy, and bankruptcy laws were tightened so no one could get out of their debt unless they paid it off. The bank owners and CEOs of large companies had grown so rich and powerful that they essentially owned the middle class, and the middle class found they were merely slaves, worse off than the poor by far, and more hungry than those in third world countries. They didn't qualify for basic government help like Medicare, food stamps, or even WIC. They could only do what the banks told them to do and try to pay off their debt before it defaulted in exchange for food and shelter. Many began working 12 hours a day just to keep their jobs. Some who were more courageous worked up to 20 hours, hoping to stow away enough money to pay off more than the huge interest fees. But thousands soon fell sick from malnutrition. By this time, the 1% were into everything. They even controlled voting in the Supreme Court with their money. When the middle class couldn't afford their own medical insurance, the president was finally able to pass socialized medical insurance so people wouldn't die in masses on the streets, but the rich wouldn't have it. That's when they started using the dogs. Someone high up had their monetary interest in the Access Medicare. They enforced a new law to be able to euthanize all cancer patients in order to cut government health care costs. Hailed as population control and propagandized as the next evolutionary step for humanity, it became a modern holocaust that no one could do anything about. The poor had no human rights or public voice, and all that mattered for the big companies was the bottom profit line. After the law was passed, the government trained German shepherds to do the same job as the GCMS machines. When the dogs found too many volatile organic compounds under the breath of the patient, they would be dragged down the hall. No one ever returned. In 10 years, all of Eurasia had joined in the same practices as the U.S., and the population was cut back by 30% around the globe. The extra money from their therapies and basic life necessities going directly back into the pockets of the filthy rich. The secretary tapped on her microphone, sending a high-pitched noise through the speakers wired to the ceiling corners of the waiting room.
In 5 minutes, the test will be conducted. At that time, those of you who are not selected are free to leave. Please return all tablets now.
Her monotone voice sounded deeper over the speakers. I imagined her 30 years older, but she probably wouldn't make it that long, the rate things were going. I turned towards my tablet.
Don't fill out your name,
the man whispered, placing his long, wrinkled fingers over my wrist. The lady beside me glared at him. "You'll get her killed," she said angrily. "If she has cancer, they'll try to find her. This will give her time." My eyes hovered over the blank where name was written underneath a long white box. My heart was racing. Maybe I would have typed my name there and shrugged him off as just a nice old man, but I hadn't been feeling right, so I quickly made up an alias and fake address and then filled out the bubbles of past medical history like normal. When I finished, I looked him in the eyes for some kind of reassurance. He seemed like a sincere man. Cataracts had put a foggy layer of film over his deep brown pupils. But deeper than that seemed a history filled with grief. His eyes conveyed an intense pain to me, and in one heartfelt look told me I should take a chance.
Return everything now.
Her voice demanded over the microphone. I stood up with tablet in hand. Maybe she wouldn't read it. Maybe she would let me go because she might be in my place at some point.
Are you done?
She asked. Yes, I said, handing it to her. She took it in her hands. The phone rang and she thrust the tablet aside.
Hello?
She said, giving me a cold look to return to my seat. I breathed a sigh of relief and sat back on the cold black plastic waiting room seats. I could hear the dogs behind the door leading to the hospital's hallways growing louder. Their leashes were jangling, and we could hear the indisputable sound of muffled boots marching towards us. Both the lady and the old man took my arms tightly. "Dear God, please help us! Dear God, please!" pleaded a woman as she fell to her knees on the floor. People gasped in fear, and someone dropped their tablet on the cold marble of the waiting room, startling the rest of us, so we all flinched and jerked backwards. The door opened suddenly, and a group of 3 large leashed German shepherds entered. Their handler was wearing green army canvas pants and a bulletproof vest and had a gun strapped to his waist. 2 other soldiers dressed in the same United States Army uniform were following directly behind him with long rifles. The dogs began to sniff. 1, good. 2, good. 3, in a scream. The crowd gasped in horror and lurched back. Someone had cancer. A man sprung up, but the 2 other soldiers caught both his arms before he could fight. He screamed and implored them, but was dragged away mechanically. Then the dogs returned intensely to their work. 4, good. 5, good.
Stay with me,
The man said. The dogs were close now. I could see their sleek muscles flexing under their long coats. They would have been beautiful dogs, with their pointed ears and healthy brown and black fur, but they looked terrible and menacing in this occupation. They sniffed the woman who was praying on the floor. She was clean. Then one of the shepherds shifted his attention towards me. I stared back into his dark eyes and already knew he could smell me as he pierced into me with that focused look. My heart pounded hard. I was sure at any moment my chest would rip open from fear, and was sure the dog could hear the blood pulsing through my veins. He was merely waiting for the moment to declare me to his handler.
Ma'am? I am not finding your name in the system.
The secretary had walked up to me and was standing in front of me now with the tablet in her hand. I stammered for a response. They were sniffing the old man. He was good, but he still gripped my arm tightly. The dogs' snouts came up to my face. They gave up a long, ear-piercing howl. The old man shot up with me. 2 soldiers who were standing in the back rushed forward. "Which one was it?"
It was me,
said the old man, shoving me away. This was my chance. I'd either die now or make a run for it. And suddenly my will to live overcame anything else in my being. It squashed my fears and choked out logic. I broke away from the crowd and thrust myself upon the door. The dogs growled and barked at me as soldiers lift rifles into the air. I pulled the metal handle of the door into my chest and felt the hot sunlight burst onto my breast as I ran out of the building. The old man had plunged himself in front of the dogs. Shots were fired and the door closed before I could look back. I sprinted to the top of a hill just past the parking lot and rolled my body into a storm gutter, tears streaming from my eyes, breath wheezing as I cried, laying in the damp dirt. I could hear people shouting at the entrance and the dogs wailing. Then 2 boots paused next to the opening of the drain. I stopped breathing all at once, pressed my body against the cold, wet cement. Short waves of brown hair sprang from all directions as a man looked upside down at me with beady hazel eyes and bushy brown eyebrows.
"Hurry,"
he said.
"I can help you."
Perplexed, I took his hand and he pulled me into the black van.
"Go, go, go!"
I said before the door was shut, driver speeding down the street. I huddled into a ball in the back of the empty van as the strange man stared at me on one bent knee.
My name is Edward,
He said finally. Stephanie Elliot. His lips were thin, and with the stubble on his face looked to be in his mid-30s. Who?
Let's just say that we offer an alternative.